You are in for a treat now because we're moving on to what is probably the most exciting part of the series. Definitely one of my most favorite topics of the series to research, work on, and present to you guys. So we've moved on from some of Morphe's classical attacking games and now moving on to Tal. Tal is everyone's favorite attacking player, former world champion, and definitely made a name for himself in chess history. But before we move on to Tal, and we have a lot to look at Tal, we're going to look at his queen sacrifices, some more classical attacking games as well, and also some positional games from Tal. A lot of people don't know that Tal was also a good positional player, and of course you have to be if you're a world champion. He was not a one-trick pony. But he is best known for his attacking games. So first we're going to look at another very well-known attacking player, at least, Nizhmedinov. And for those of you chess history buffs, you will definitely know who Nizhmedinov is. He was one of Tal's contemporaries and arguably one of the most creative and attacking players himself. And he scalped a few wins against former world champions as well. He ended up having the IM title. He never got to GM, and it's not clear why. After you see his games, they're brilliant, but unlike Tal, he wasn't always able to play positionally. So if his opponent gave him chances to play attacking chess, there's no chance Nishmedinov would just finish things off. And here we're going to look at one of his most famous games against Oleg Chernikov, played in Rostov 1962. This is just an emblematic game, and it's hard not to want to play an attacking style after looking at Morphy's games, Nishmedinov's games, and then Tal's games. Of course, who wouldn't want to play like this? The problem is that nowadays thinking has evolved. So unlike Morphy's day, where people just usually took sacrifices and went right into the lines on principle, chess doesn't work like that anymore. So you have to be more universal, and we'll look at that as well. Okay, so here we started off. Nothing too crazy happening yet. Let's just move back a little bit. So knight g4, typical way here to exchange in the center on d4. So Nizhmedinov places his queen on h4, this very insidious placement. It's eyeing bishop h6, but it looks like there's nothing really to attack with here. So why is this part of the attacking portion of the video? Well, we'll see in a second that it's mainly for this sacrifice right here. This position goes down in chess history. Now, where would you move here for white? Okay, I'll give you 3 guesses, and I'll be surprised if you can guess the move, even having 3 guesses. Okay, not queen h6, although that's a fine move. Runs into bishop g7, you'd probably have to move back. Queen g4, also viable option. Queen h3, we're not really worried about black going d5 here and making a discovery. Okay, now if you've never seen this game before and you found queen takes f6 in this line, then attacking chess is definitely for you, to say the least. So queen takes f6, brilliant, inspired sacrifice, just giving up the queen for a bishop. I mean, I bet Nizhmedinov's opponent here was shocked. I can just imagine his reaction here. 1962, queen takes f6, move 12. So, he doesn't take back immediately, and the idea being that at least white gets 2 pieces for the queen, and still an imbalance. Black would probably be better materially, but the imbalance here favors white. So what black did here is played knight e2 check first, and now he took on f6. So this forced white's knight away from c3 and away from controlling the d5 square in one move, and also prevented white from getting bishop d4 in with the tempo, because that would have been the optimal piece placement. So white goes back to knight c3 because, as I said, white wants to put the knight on d5. And you'll see what Nizhmedinov did here, which was he sacrificed his queen for this amazing positional bind. And maybe this game would better go in the portion of the series on positional chess, because this is more of a positional sacrifice than an attacking sacrifice, and we'll look at Tal's attacking games. But I wanted to just go over this game really quickly first to put it into historical context for Tal, because this was one of Tal's contemporaries, and this was just the way chess was played in those days. Don't you miss those days of chess where, you know, people made calculated sacrifices, of course, but the chess was very inspired, and there were a lot of imbalances in the position nowadays. You know, everything is cranked out by the computer up until move 20 or 30, and there's little creativity early on. So he gets this optimal piece placement aiming for f6. And this is very difficult for black to face. So black can't, do anything about the pieces on the d file by white. In the meantime, they are exerting very uncomfortable pressure on f6. So the only pieces that black has to defend upon in f6 are heavy pieces. But of course, if you do that too many times, white will end up getting the material back. So white has 2 pieces for queen, 2 minor pieces, and they're just very well placed here. Arguably, they are as powerful as a queen, and white is by no means worse. Black is the one that has to react to what white is doing. So again, this concept of action and reaction, and the side that's usually in control of the game and that is forcing the way the game is played is going to have at least the psychological edge, and this action-reaction concept, as we'll cover later on, is an excellent platform for creating chances in worse positions and equal positions. I mean, I would say that's the breeding ground for creativity in fighting chess. So it calmly continues developing like nothing has happened, and adds an extra line of attack on the f6 pawn, and now black can't defend it any further, so he tries to see how he can cope by losing it. After knight takes f6, white is markedly better here already, so white definitely had the initiative even a few moves ago. But can you imagine, back when queen takes f6 was played on move 12, to foresee this positioning of the pieces would end up? But it's not even so much that Nizhmarinov would have had to calculate 10 moves ahead to this position, but it's just appreciating the nature of the position so much that he sees that this is the way that the pieces are going to be positioned, and there's nothing black can do to stop it. And, white does have an attack here. The king is weak, and once this f6 square is infiltrated, black really has to watch out. And bishop e2 was a mistake, the decisive mistake, because this allows white a clear path to victory with knight takes h7 check. This is where these attacking tactics come in. This is what we like to see. And black can't take on h7 here because of rook takes f7. King g8, bishop takes e6 is winning, and if king h6, then white has bishop g7 check. King h7, bishop f6 check wins back the queen when you're already up a lot of material, so you want to avoid that. And then bishop takes e6 anyway. So now, just look at this position. White has 3 pawns, a rook, and a bishop for a queen, but no one needs this queen. And check out this rook on a8 that is not participating at all, and this king on h5. It's definitely an unpleasant position for black, completely winning for white here. But it takes just so much creativity and intuition in order to be able to appreciate imbalances like that, and that's the mark of an attacking player. So this is a sign that you should try to adopt the style of one of these players, is if you feel comfortable in imbalanced positions. So a lot of players, when there's an imbalance, such as an exchange sacrifice, material imbalance, anything along those lines, even the positional imbalance, the players get scared and they try to make the position more comfortable and go back to what they're used to. But the attacking players, they have to embrace imbalances because they know that's where complications arise. And that's where they're going to have opportunities for a lot of tactics, like knight takes h7. Again, this is premised on the fact that after rook takes f7, there's going to be additional material imbalances, but white appreciates that, whereas black doesn't. So black didn't take on h7, he retreated to g8, and white played rook h3, taking control of the h-file. So now we see really this mating threat, and it's amazing that this entire attack is taking place without a queen, and that this attack took maybe 7 moves to get off the ground by the time that white went knight d5, bishop d4, swung the rook over. And you would think that in an attack, speed is of the essence, and it usually is. So don't just start an attack if it takes you 8 moves to execute it. But this is where positional understanding also comes in, that, white recognized that black could not put up much resistance, so white had a clear path to setting up the pieces the way he wanted, and then suddenly, all of these pieces are functioning the way a queen would, even better, because you have the knight and the bishop and the rook all coordinated, all perfectly synchronized. And let's just take a moment to appreciate how strong these 2 bishops are. We'll see this come up in Tal's games too. I mean, everything is aimed at the king. So this gets to the point where black has no choice but to give up material. And when you've forced matters like this, where black is trying to give up material in order to save himself, you're in good shape. So maybe a better try for black would have been to go rook h5 to block the h-file, but then white has knight f6, so of course it's not a very comfortable move for black to make. Took on f1. And he's just ready to give up the rook, just take the rook. Because at least it temporarily blocks the diagonal for a bit. And it opens up the d-file for the queen. So maybe now black's queen can come in. And of course you don't want to take on e5. Because this would end up being a perpetual check. And we'll cover perpetual checks in fighting in the endgame. And perpetual checks are the worst thing to run into when you're winning in the endgame, and especially after playing a beautiful game like this, don't want to give it away by falling for this. So after f takes e5, here you don't have to take on e5. The right move would be to go rook d3 first. Intermediate move to kick the queen out of the d-file. But Nishmatinov, he didn't even want to give black any chances. He didn't even take the rook. He doesn't need the rook because he's not concerned about material. Once you sacrifice your queen, are you really playing for the material count? He played bishop d4, and this is just one of those moves where it's really telling black, I'm playing for the win here. You are reacting to what I'm doing, and I don't even care which pieces you give back to me. And this is such an important concept that we're going to see later, is this practical move of bishop d4. So objectively speaking, f takes e5, winning back the rook, d takes e5, rook d3 is an objectively stronger move. That's what the computer will tell you. But bishop d4 is, just practically speaking, a more powerful move, because black is in a bind again. He's in the same situation he was before. His rook is still under attack. White temporarily blocked the d-file in case that exchange happens again, and white also has other threats up his sleeve. Remember, something like knight f6 could happen if black moves the rook. So black just is in a tough spot, whereas in the other position, even if it's objectively better, it's a lot easier for black to play, because look, he had this idea of bringing the queen to d1, starting perpetual check. If you're going to open up lines, it's going to activate the rook and the queen, which is all that black has going for him in this position, and you don't want to do that. So this goes back to a core principle of practical chess, where even if there's an objectively better move, and that's more of a post hoc determination anyway, because during the game you won't really know that until you plug the game into the computer and check it out. But over the board, if you see something that looks like it should objectively be better, but it would require absolute precision in order to play, and the utmost calculation, and you couldn't make a misstep, otherwise you give your opponent too many chances, versus a move that maybe is not as good, but it's a lot more difficult for your opponent to deal with it, and you're still the one in control, go with the second alternative. Go with the more practical move. because at the end of the day, when you're playing over the board in a competition, and this is what this series is about, this is not for, those computer bliss games. This is for preparing you to play over the board practically, make the right decisions at the board, conserve time on your clock, put pressure on your opponent, maximize the resources that you have to convert those wins, and you just need to make the right decisions at the right times, and you need to make the practical decision. So here, Bishop d4, very tough move to play against, and you'll see that black is going to crack here because he's not going to know what to do, so he starts going b5, trying to create some sort of counterplay on the queen side. I guess an idea is to go a5, a4, but it's just too slow, and this is exactly what white was waiting for. So black could have put up better resistance by going into a ridiculous line, like rook takes e4, allowing knight f6, and then sacrificing the queen back into an ending like this. Would force white to, at least make some accurate moves in converting this ending. White is still winning, but this was black's best practical chance, but it's such a hard move to make psychologically, of course, whereas in this other line where if white had taken on e5 first, black has a clear-cut plan of rolling down the d file, and then after rook d3, black can play queen h4 and create some counterplay. So didn't want to allow that, but bishop d4 really puts black in a tough spot. Goes b5, misses knight g5. And, I mean, look at the amazing scope of this knight. Went from c3 to d5, f6, h7 to g5. Check out that knight maneuver. And, I mean, so something that white is threatening is to take on f7 multiple ways. Rook h8 is also in the air. And again, knight g5 is just one of those moves where you don't appreciate how strong it is until the move is made. And once the move is made, and you start thinking about it, you realize, oh no, what am I going to do against this? Because white has so many threats here, black has no counterplay. And if you're the type of player that can appreciate these moves and whose intuition is good enough that these moves stick out, so at this point, it's not even about can you calculate knight g5 through, because there are a lot of threats here, taking on f7, taking on e5, and of course, black still can't move that rook from e5 because rook h8 is coming in. There's also threats of going rook h8, taking on f7, winning back the queen on d8. Just lots of different things in the air. So if you're the type of player that thrives in these positions and has the intuition to see these moves in the first place, like if knight g5 jumps out at you as some kind of candidate move, at least within your top three, then you know that you have the intuition of an attacking player. So black tries to defend on f7, but it doesn't help too much because now white has a simple liquidation tactic here. Very nice way to finish things off. And black resigned here because white has two pieces for a rook and is also a pawn up and is about to win another pawn. And these pawns here, one of them is going to end up promoting, and black just can't do anything about it. It doesn't have enough resources. So, very nice game by white. This is probably one of my favorite games in chess. And a lot of lessons, and very inspired play by Nizhmarinov. I wanted to at least bring him up in this video series. He's not a very well-known player, but he does have a following, and he probably has this side cult following of Nizhmarinov fans. But he definitely deserves to be recognized, and he contributed a lot to attacking theory in chess, and has had a very similar style to Tal in terms of at least the attacking games. So now we're going to move over to, I guess, the portion of the series that a lot of us have been waiting for, and we'll take a look at some of Mikahil Tal's games. We just examined an inspired queen sacrifice by Nizhmarinov. Now we're moving on to Tal. So let's start with one of his most famous queen sacrifices as well. And this game is Tal against Hans from Varna 1962. So this is a Queen's Indian and Nimzo Indian hybrid. Black takes on c3. Get somewhat of a strange pawn structure here, but after e4, already white has a strong pawn center. And Tal maintains the tension for now. He has the option of taking on e5, whereas black may be hesitant about undoubling white's pawn, so it's really white that's the one that's going to force things in the center here. And as we know, it's always important to be in control, especially when you're on the attack. Okay, now black is getting too creative for his own good here. He needs to consolidate, just get his king to safety instead of maneuvering his knights, because this plan with knight f8 could have worked if the position were closed, but the problem is that white has the option of opening up the center, and that's what Tal was known for, is that he detected as soon as there was a possibility to open up lines, and he went for it no matter what it took. So here he went c5. He just opened lines on his own terms, increased the tension, and now he has the option of taking on b6, d6, e5. Meanwhile, black can't castle on the king side, and it doesn't look like his king is in danger, but knowing Tal, he can sense blood, and he knows the right moment to strike. So here black took on c5, and white effectively misplaced black's queen. It's on e5 while black's c-pawns are doubled. And now white starts developing his pieces, aiming them at the king with queen a4 check. 2 shots in 1. So black should block with one of the knights, but he didn't want to abandon his plan of transferring the knight to g6. And that's a fallacy of once you start maneuvering or repositioning your pieces, you want to go through with it even if the nature of the position has changed. But unfortunately, you just have to recognize when the right moment to abandon your plan. It's here black went c6, but this, of course, locks in, the bishop on b7, which is now a dud. So this gives time for white to castle, no rush. Tal had enviable patience, even in the sharpest positions, which is one of the secrets to his success. He was not all about tricks, and we saw the same type of patience from Nizhmedinov, and it took him 8 moves to reposition his pieces. So that's another, I would say, not so well-known element of an attacking player, is knowing when to make patient moves. So attacking chess is not just about sack, mate. That's just if you see a tactic, or if you see a mate in 3, then you'll go with that. But real attacking chess is knowing how to exploit weaknesses in your opponent's position, but also knowing how to position your pieces in order to maximize the attack. And a lot of times that involves patience in terms of remaneuvering your pieces or completing development of your pieces. So if you don't have that type of patience, you have to be careful, because you're going to end up making sacrifices which could be sound, but if you don't bring all of your pieces into the attack, they're not going to work out. So unlike in positional chess where you could spend a lot of time maneuvering, and it's about patience there too, but it's a different type of patience. It's more about reservation. Here it's just the patience of finishing your opponent off. It's not always going to be a clear-cut victory. You're not always going to have these 16-move miniatures. It'll take time. So now that white is castled, now he can start moving his other pieces. White goes knight c4, eyeing the d6 square, of course. So black retreats to e6, and continuing with putting pressure on accessing this d6 square while opening even more lines is e5. And this also paves the way for opening up the e file, and now the game is going to get very complicated very quickly. So for example, if black takes on e5, this runs into rook e1, so of course we're not worried about losing the e5 pawn. But Tal allows black to play b5, and he of course had to calculate that and had to be prepared to be uncomfortable with the prospect of losing a piece, or again, this is the concept of losing time and patience that you have to be aware of. So b5, it attacks the queen, it forces white to make a decision and to do something. And are you going to be comfortable in these types of positions where it's not always going to be a clear-cut way to victory? So if you're white here, how would you continue? Okay, well, I hope that the last two games didn't give away the theme of what we're going with here, because white took on f6. You know, of course, we don't need a queen, and we have all of these other pieces for the attack. Yeah, even looking at these last two games, I'm reconsidering how much do you really need a queen to attack in chess? I mean, it's amazing how powerful the other pieces are if you just play them the right ways. Like, Tal, played every piece to his strength no matter what. So this is going to require very extreme accuracy here. Take on g7. This had to be calculated. And now this is another good place to pause the video and to try to calculate how to continue here. So there's a lot of options here for white. Bishop f5 is the right move. You may have been thinking of rook e1 because it pins the queen to the king, but this just allows knight takes h4, after which rook takes e6. Black is going to end up just being a rook up, because remember, the point of sacrificing and attacking is not to win back the material a few moves later. So if you're too clingy to material count, you won't make a very good attacking player, because once you sacrifice, you're playing for the non-material elements of the position, which is time, its space, its initiative, it's the coordination of pieces, the connection between the pieces, even if you're not playing with the material counts themselves. So if you're too attached to material, this won't work, because you can't make moves like rook e1 here. Instead, bishop f5. So yes, this does attack the queen, but it's not so much that white is so much threatening to take the queen as he is preparing other things in this position. And he's fine with even giving up a second knight, because bishop f5 serves a dual purpose in terms of cutting off the enemy king, and he's almost provoking black to take an additional piece. And white is still down the full queen now. So first it was for a piece, now they're down the full queen, but black's king is stuck in the center. Can't move, and look how active these two bishops are again. Attacking players love these double bishops, just as strong as a queen. Because after queen e6, now we can take on e6, because now g6 is hanging. So we have a bishop for a rook, but after a maneuver like this, you're going for mate here. And this would be a checkmate. And if black avoids that by going king c8, then you simply go this route and checkmate this way. So this is about recognizing the power of the two bishops. Very strong here. We're not worried about the knight on c4, bishop f5. Very provocative move. And of course you can't take on f5 because of knight d6 check. So then white is going to win back the queen. And now the material count is even, but now white has a pawn on g7, which is a monster pawn. And so this is a good way to give back material. You want to look out for liquidation tactics. You don't want to look at forcing ways to win back material at the expense of giving away your entire attack. If you're going to even up the material, make sure you come out on top afterwards. So black takes on h4. Good decision. Definitely want to eliminate the power of those double bishops. So we're taking on e6. And if take back immediately, this runs into knight d6, so black tries to avoid that by going bishop h6, so there's a lot of tactics and counter tactics in the air, but white continues knight d6. And now there's this key defensive resource of bishop c4, and this is what Tal had to see back when he played bishop f5, this retreat, because the lines up to this point were almost forcing, but if you don't see bishop c4, this line is not going to work, because otherwise white would end up a piece down. Whereas here, the material count is even, and even though white came away with the pawn down, black structure is ruined, and these doubled pawns on the c file barely rise to the level of having an extra pawn. So that's what I mean when I say the material count is even, because in terms of pieces it's even, and in pawns, even though white is a pawn down, these double pawns don't add much. I wouldn't even say that black has an extra pawn in this position. So the complications are over, and the attack was a success. White never gave black the opportunity to castle and bring his king to safety, and just every move was some kind of attack, something that would make black react to what white is doing. So let's just take a look back here to c5, just opening up lines. So in your games, if you see that your opponent is stalling in terms of development or getting his king to safety, but the center is not closed yet. So this was black's mistake, was just going knight f8. In principle, this may be the right maneuver. I understand black wants to get the knight to g6 and to f4, but it's just too slow because white has this break with c5 or taking on e5, and white is in control of things. And now if black tries to go knight g6, it's too late because white has too many forcing moves here. So knight c4, e5, everything is an attacking move. And even after b5, you're not worried about the queen, just opening up more lines. So you open up the d file, open up the e file, aiming for the king. Remember, goal of chess is to checkmate, so if you can do that earlier, why not? And precise calculation. That's, the way of the attacking players. If you're going to be creative, make sure you have what it takes to back up these really creative, intuitive sacrifices. You need precise calculation, otherwise you're just going to end up being down material. And you're going to think that you're winning, but if you don't see moves like bishop c4, it's not going to work out. And this is where white's positional prowess comes into play. So I mentioned at the beginning of this that to be a world champion, you have to be good at everything. You can't just be a good attacking player. So Tal executed this attack in order to force this positionally superior structure. And from this, just look at how easily he converts it. Just taking control of both files, B file, D file. Bringing the king to the center. No, he doesn't even take back on c4 because this gives the king a pocket to hide here on c5. So look how white restrains black's king using his own pawns against him. So kicking back the knight. White is still on the offensive, taking control of the 7th rank. And this is easy. This is, Tal is in his element here as well. Now the pawns are even. It doesn't really matter. White was better anyway. And now he just picked the right time to convert to winning rook ending. And pawns are even here. I would say black would have good drawing chances here. And later on in the series, we'll look at fighting back in the endgame, where I advocate if you have the chance to exchange into a rook ending because the drawing chances increase, and especially a double rook ending because that creates the opportunities for perpetual checks. And that's a good way to fight back from lost middle game positions and to save those extra half points. Here, unfortunately, white is just too far along, so white went from being a pawn down to now being a pawn up. And he has a pass pawn. Black just can't coordinate his rooks. That's the problem. If you're going into rook ending, double rook ending, make sure the rooks are coordinated. Otherwise, if the other side has 2 rooks and is up in material and the rooks are better coordinated, like here, the rooks are completely controlling the 5th rank, attacking the D pawn and helping this pawn promote. Still some drawing chances, but look, this is, piece of cake for world championships and world champions, and black resigned here. But just for practice, do you see the last tactic here? Just go over this. So both sides queen at the same time, but white has queen b3 check. Hope you saw this. So this forces the exchange, and white is going to promote with this pawn at the end. So that's the idea, pan rook g5. So even to the end, We're looking at tactics, looking at forcing moves, and that's the mark of a positional player, and that's the typical Tal flair to finish a game off in that way. And it's hard to believe that this rook ending happened back from this position where white sacrificed the queen, and I use sacrifice loosely because he just almost gave up the queen. He ignored that the queen was lost because he continued with his own attack. And this is, just emblematic of an attacking game. And it's games like this that make all of us want to be attacking players so that we can see brilliancies like these in our own games. We're having so much fun looking at attacking queen sacrifices. Why stop now? Tal's games are full of them. So let's take a look at one more. And I want to go over this because every sacrifice is different. No two queen sacrifices are the same. But the elements underlying them are different, and that's just the attitude in executing them, coordinating pieces, finding the right weaknesses to exploit. And that's not something that you can just read off of a list, memorize, and apply to your own games. I can tell you what these elements are, but you need to see them in action, and you need to apply them to your own game. So it's just looking at lots of different games, recognizing these patterns, and applying the same creative principles to your game. So that's what we're doing here by looking at all of these sacrificing games. Here we're looking at a game between Tal and Ludikov from 1964. And this is the Elephant Gambit, in case you were wondering what happened in the opening here. This certainly doesn't happen nowadays. You don't see this at top-level chess. But there was a lot of theory to this. So if black plays queen e7, then white preserves the d5 pawn, so black goes f5, and that's bold, especially against Tal. This is 1964, so we know what Tal is about, but his opponent is voluntarily opening up the f-file and weakening the f7 square. And Tal barely even had to do anything. So, of course, d3, opening up lines, undermining the center. Okay, so this all had to be calculated before, and white is ahead here, and for some gambit with this elephant gambit, black really didn't play it properly because white still has the extra pawn, white has the initiative, and sure, white may end up with doubled pawns, but it's really black that is struggling here and can't castle. So white could retake on f3 now, but Tal found a better move, an attacking move with bishop g5. The idea is that after c takes d5, immediately castle to safety while controlling the d-file and gearing up to put pressure on this king, which is, again, stuck in the center. Now, you may think that, why are all of Tal's opponents not castling and just letting him attack, and why doesn't anyone play against me like that? Well, first of all, in your games, you'd be surprised at the opportunities you would have to exploit the placement of your opponent's king, especially if they're stalling their development. You just need to be bold. And, here, someone's intuition may be, well, e takes f3, let me take back immediately on f3, and that's normal move, but bishop g5 is even better because you want to rapidly develop, centralize your rook, get it out to the e-file as quickly as possible. So that's one thing. There are opportunities in games to exploit this, but you also have to start playing the right openings, and this is part of the series, is if you want to be an attacking player, if you're inspired by these games, then you'll have to play, more gambits or something that will give you the initiative, even if you end up with less material, because if you're trying to get an attack going from, in exchange French or something, well, good luck. It's not going to come to fruition, so you have to pick the right openings, and yes, your opponents have to comply a little bit, but you'd be surprised if you want to get attacking positions like this, you can. The drawback is that it won't work against a well-prepared player, but for practical players like us, even up to, I'd say, the 2400 level, these openings would work, and there are definitely some strong players who do have very strong, sharp repertoires. Think of Enrico Civiano, Mark Esserman, just a whole host of players who do pretty well with it. But Tal is good at all types of attacks. So in the next game I'm foreshadowing, we'll look at a game where White did castle to safety, but Black somehow managed to pry the position open anyway. So there was no hiding from Mikahil Tal. You're just developing, you know, White is just ignoring the pawn on f3, can take it whenever he wants. So you do have to calculate in these lines, what if Black takes on g2? Well, you get rook e1 in with a tempo, which is what we wanted anyway, and then Black's entire position falls apart. And White ends up being a bishop up, so Black has to play queen e7 immediately here. Now this looks to the last line that we just looked at, but White is not up a piece yet. So what does White do here? Okay, well, this queen sacrifice is even more stunning than the last one. White played rook e1, and again, I use the term sacrifice loosely because it's hardly a sacrifice so much as Tal just ignored capturing back the queen because he has better things to do, and he knows time is of the essence here. So completing his development, but also positioning his rooks on the e-file, and I laugh about completing development because it's not about development at this point. It's just about bringing all of your pieces in to the attack. But the fact that he is ahead in development arguably does help him here because he has the full force of these two rooks, which are hitting this king, which has no protection, whereas Black's two rooks are out of the game, and since they're on this back rank here, they're cut off from the action. So they're just hitting each other, and they're not really helping out here. So of course you have to calculate ways in which Black can extricate his queen from this. So if Black does nothing and White takes back the queen, then Black is going to end up with a pin on e6 and be down a piece. So Black does have to try to preserve his queen somehow, but it's more of a question at this point of where do you move the queen? You can move it to a5, c5, b4 maybe. Black chose c5 in the game. If you went queen a5, you would swing your bishop this way, and Black is out of moves. This is just a sample line for you. And you'll win back the queen. Black goes queen a4. Take on e6 with the bishop, very important, because you get this tempo, so if you're down the queen, you have to rely on other things in your position, like time advantage, space advantage, and any extra tempos that you can get, like bishop e3, you have to watch out for. But look, there's no clear mate here, so this is not, White sacrificed his queen and then found the checkmate in 5 moves. This is like the last few games that we looked at, and this is why I wanted to go over these games, because this is the pinnacle of queen sacrifices. And there is no clear mate in 5 here. This is about taking advantage of the weaknesses in your opponent's position, making the most of the resources that you have, and the coordination. So this is one of those situations where the connectors, the elements between the pieces, are stronger than the actual pieces themselves. So you should be prepared to play like this and be prepared to accept a material deficit for these intangible advantages if you're an attacking player, and it is uncomfortable. It doesn't go against the principles that we all learned as beginners in chess. It does take a lot of creativity, and that is why players like Tal are considered geniuses and why we try to emulate them. But it's not the easiest thing to pull off. So I mean, you either have to have a natural intuition or inclination for it, or be well versed in openings that can lead to these types of positions and be comfortable in these material imbalances. And that's the mark of an attacking player. And you also have to be prepared to convert your advantage into a positional or endgame advantage, because it doesn't always end in a checkmate. So in this situation, there is a calculation that is required here. So even the c3 pawn gets in on the action here. And so you end up going for mate this way. And again, it's like these resources are coming out of nowhere, but white's pieces are just so active and so well coordinated, and it's that coordination, I can't stress that enough, that everything seems to come together. And Tal was known as the magician from Riga because it looked like, he's pulling all of these moves, these tactics, like a magician out of a hat. But he recognized the nature of the position, and he wouldn't have went into the sacrifice if he didn't calculate it fully. So Black played queen c5, which is understandable, keeping the queen a bit closer to the king. Here white took on e6. So what happens after king f7? Okay, well, I hope you saw this. So this is a double check after king on s6, which is why the king has to return to e7, and now there's a checkmate in one. Rook f7 is the easier one. Rook f5 is the more difficult one to find here. So you have to see those checkmates in twos. Remember, if you want to play attacking chess, your tactics have to be 100%. There's no room for error with the tactics. So tactics, they're just a layer on top, but the substance has to be there in terms of the management of the imbalances and recognizing the nature of the position. Okay, so black didn't make it that easy for white. He retreated to f8. And what's the move for white now? Okay, well, we sacrificed the queen. Why stop there? And again, it's not about holding on to the material of the position, because once you sacrifice your queen, you're not playing to get material back. You're playing to gain as much initiative as you can in the position from the various intangible elements. So here white realizes there's a good opportunity for another sacrifice. Rook takes f6 in order to provide more open lines for the two bishops. So we see, again, it's powerful two bishop. It looks like every time there's a queen sacrifice, we get these very strong bishop pair coming in. So bishop h6 is now a threat. If the rook were on e1, that would definitely be a mating threat. But rook takes f6 also served the purpose of clearing this e6 square for the knight. So knight e6 comes in with the check. And you win back the queen. And again, it's this liquidation tactic. So black was just totally taken off guard, didn't defend using the most resistance, and gave up the queen, and now white ended up with two bishops and the pawn against the rook. But this, it was a stunning queen sacrifice, or this delayed queen recapture, whatever you want to call it. But Tal just had so much up his sleeve and such a great understanding of the elements of the position. And he just knew when the time was for an attack. Okay, so now white only has a bishop and a pawn for a rook. But white still has a tremendous initiative leveled against black's king, so the attack is still not over. And because white's pieces are optimally placed, he's better positioned to handle an endgame. And in an endgame, especially with the rooks, when the take control of the 7th or 2nd rank as quickly as possible, oftentimes that depends on who can infiltrate first, and white's pieces are better placed to achieve that. So now up 2 pawns. Three pawns. So finally take that pawn in f3. Did we forget about that pawn? Was that there the whole time? Well, I mean, it's funny. He could have taken back with the g pawn so many times to double it up, but no, he probably saw this all the way back 15 moves ago, that he would take back with the bishop. And another similar conversion of this black resigned here, because white is going to take back on a2, and then white already has a pass pawn here, and resistance is futile. Black won't be able to stop the pawn. You'll have to give up one of the rook for one of the pieces, and it'll be a clear path to victory. So His opponent had enough. His head was probably spinning after that. But I guess when you try to play a gambit against Tal, you better be sure that it works, because otherwise something like this happens. Another brilliancy, a very inspiring win by Tal here. So I did say that we're going to look at a more normal game by Tal where his opponent castled and he unleashed an attack that way, and it wasn't ripping through the center with crazy queen sacrifices like we looked at in the other games, even though those games were, of course, inspirational and we love attacking games like that, but you can't always get that, unfortunately. So this game is between Boris Spassky, a former world champion, against Mikahil Tal, who is black. Played in Tallinn in 1973, and this game was very nicely covered by Larry Christensen in his book Storming the Barricade. So we have this Nimzo Indian Leningrad variation. And we'll see how Tal gets himself into his element even against an opponent who obviously knows what his playing style is and who is very adept at pushing through his own style. And you would think that he would avoid an attacking game, but Tal usually, finds a way to get the type of positions that he wants, and he was a master at being resourceful. So this looks a bit more normal than some of the games we've looked at earlier. So we had this position with the b5 break. We looked at that in the structures, a bit different here. But similar elements to the Benko. And you see this working where you're undermining the center, getting a strong hold of it with d5. And following up with a6 in order to activate the pieces on the queen side that are left a bit underdeveloped here. And while you do have strong control of the center as black here because you undermined it through b5, now is the time to strike. And as always, Tal looks for opportunities to open up lines. And before it's too late, before white can castle, d4. And this requires some calculation, because after e takes d4, what do you think he took back with? Well, that's a bit of a trick question, because instead Tal took on f3, and decided to take back with the pawn this way. And he won the knight, and already here he's better, and here we have yet another imbalance. Black has two minor pieces for a rook and two pawns temporarily. And it's just one of those imbalanced positions that you have to be comfortable playing. So white did end up castling. Look at here, how often do Tal's opponents get to castle? Well, admittedly, we did look at a biased sample where Tal did sacrifice his queens against uncastled kings. But here, opponent is castled, so how do you get things going here? Well, black still has two bishops in the position, so that's always something that can be leveraged, as we've seen. And black has amazing scope of his bishops and control here. And he'll eventually activate his light squared bishop. So here we see an option where black can take on a1. But this would lead to an even game. Instead, Tal keeps the imbalance because he knows that this is the type of position that he thrives in, and he realizes the power of his minor pieces. And even though the king looks like it's protected, you'll see how strong the two bishops are against it, and how you can almost force white to create weaknesses here. So white has to watch out for the back rank here, and this move defends the bishop on c8, and black is going to try to aim to get it to a6 somehow. So Tal remaneuvers the bishop from b4 to c5, just aiming ever so slightly at the f2 square. It's not like there's a sacrifice there immediately, but maybe something is in the air because the rook on c2 is unprotected, so there could be some tactics there. So just slowly putting pressure, just watch how he activates all of his pieces. And here he still has his queen, so look how he plays with his queen and how he uses it in conjunction with the two bishops and the rook. So if white tries to remove the rook from c2 and out of the c file so that there aren't any more tricks with taking on f2, then black would reposition the bishop to d4, follow up with e5, and then anchor it on d4. And then a bishop anchored like that is as good as a rook, and then black has an extra bishop to boot. So instead, white tries to simplify, but black refuses this, realizing that it's too early to exchange into an endgame, doesn't yet have the advantage he wants, and positions his queen on a dangerous square, queen f4. So it is aiming at f2, providing additional reinforcement for that, and also possibly preparing maneuvers such as bishop d6, aiming for checkmate there. And it's just really untouchable on f4 at the moment, so it is a good position for the queen. White continues to try to chase. Black retreats, but also attacks the rook on c2. And the bishop is activated. And now we see the two bishops aiming against the king, and white really has to watch out. And even though white is castled, there's definitely an attack brewing here. So white's goal here is just to exchange queens because white knows what's coming, and he knows that his drawing chances here would be to simplify into some kind of endgame where he could put up resistance, but otherwise having two bishops that strong plus a queen controlling diagonal is more than the position could handle. And what white really wants to do here is just to find some kind of safe square for his king, and it looks strange because the king does look safe on g1, but the back rank is a bit weak. And also, there could be potential sacrifices on f2, on g2. It's not the most comfortable position for white. So this is a great example of a piece attack by black. This is not a pawn storm. You don't see an immediate sacrifice against the king. You saw an earlier sacrifice. This rook takes f3 move, this ingenious way of activating all of the pieces, but the attack itself is not fueled by a sacrifice. So we're seeing how to leverage the pieces and just aiming at the king, and the first thing that we're seeing here is the perseverance. So white keeps offering queen trades, black keeps resisting queen trades, but not only does he avoid the queen trades, he actually finds a superior square for the queen. The queen went from f4 to f5 to g5, having served purposes at each of those individual squares. And it's working in conjunction with the other minor pieces. So the queen on the f-file was exerting a lot of pressure on f2, a lot of uncomfortable pressure. And very soon, the bishop on b7 is going to become activated. So for example, if white makes a move like queen g3 to try and continue chasing the queen here, now bishop takes f2 works, and doesn't look immediately so clear how it ends up working, but you'll see that after king takes f2, you have this tactic thanks to the queen, and if queen takes f2, then queen takes c1, this very undermining capture, forcing an endgame with the piece up. So it definitely has to be careful if they're making moves on autopilot and just trying to exchange queens blindly here. Also, making an innocuous seemingly move like h3 in order to create a pocket for the king won't work either. Using similar undermining tactic, bishop a3. So let's not forget that the rook on c6 is also part of the game, and we're fighting for control of the c-file here. Because after rook takes c6, you take on c1, keeping this pin for the time being. Really using all of their resources here. And again, ending up in an ending with the piece up. So you see those tactics come out of nowhere. The magician from Riga strikes again. White removes the queen from that side of the board, realizing it's dangerous. But as soon as he does that, then black is in the clear to unleash an attack on the king. And where do you think black went here? Just very subtle, quiet move. It's not what you may think. It's not bishop takes f2, because remember, attacks take patience, and you need to be able to reposition your pieces and have proper intuition for where all of the pieces belong. That's very important in positional play too, but in attacking play, they're just serving a different purpose. They're serving the purpose, aiming at some target, usually the king. So rook c7, rook is defending everything and completely clears the way for the bishop, and suddenly we see this new weakness arise here. Mate is threatened. So white defends by going g3, which looks obvious, but now black has succeeded in creating a tangible weakness in white's position. So before it looked like the king was protected behind the pawns and it wasn't possible to break through them, but after g3, this creates so many weaknesses, activates the bishop, but we don't even need to worry about leveraging the bishop just yet, because this walks right into a tactic with bishop takes f2. And this is the start of a very entertaining king hunt. You'll see how the Tal pursues Spassky's king across the board, and this is one of those moments that requires precise calculation, and that's, you know, the layer of Tal's play that Tal was known for is the calculation that ties everything together. So he wouldn't just make unsound sacrifices based on tuition. They were backed up by something. And he finds the accurate continuations here. So he sacrifices the bishop in order to expose the king, and now substitutes the queen for the control of the dark squares. Yes, finally getting control of that a6 square after we saw that break with b5 and the remaneuvering of the pieces on the queen side. The bishop is finally placed where it belongs, and this is a very important subtlety in this position, is going bishop a6. It looks like rook f7 could be doing something, but it's too early for that. But that will come later, so we're moving the king out and maintaining the pursuit. So the rook is serving a purpose on the c file, because if rook f2, the rook on c1 would be hanging. So white has no choice but to keep moving the king. Black keeps chasing the king. And queen d4 check, if black wanted a draw, he would probably go for that, but we're going for the win here. Moving the bishop back to b7, so you get the queen to e4. Very nice maneuver, because look, if you wanted to get the queen and the bishop on this diagonal together, you couldn't when the queen was back here, even before the bishop was sacrificed. You would love to get the queen to d5, right, so that you could create those mating threats on g2 or h1, but the queen on b3 for the time being is at least controlling d5, and getting the queen to e4 would take a lot of work. So if you try to make a move like queen e5, would run into queen d3. And if you try to make a move like queen f5, just aiming to get the queen to e4 is the idea. Well, this runs into rook takes c5 now. Just one of those liquidating tactics where white ends up being a pawn up. So you have to be careful. You have to act quickly, and Tal always sensed the right moment to do this, because, you know, if you're too late, the advantage will fizzle out, and he was just an expert in timing these so perfectly. So he took on f2, got the king out, and calculated this maneuver so that now he got the queen and the bishop on this long diagonal with the tempo, whereas it wasn't possible to do that before. And once the queen and the bishop are like this, we know that they are a power duo, and it's going to be very difficult to disrupt their coordination at all. So you can't stop the queen and the bishop when they're poised like that. So all you can do is try to create some further escape scores for your king. That's why white went h4, but this leads into a very fatal king hunt with a very bad ending for white here. So now we activate the rook on f7, bring that into the game. And again, this bishop a6 maneuver proves lethal. Game ended here, but you can see what happens after something like king g2. There's no hope. So seemingly out of nowhere, black got white's king out of the shelter of the h, g, and f pawns, provoked weaknesses, just found the right maneuver to reposition his queen and his bishop. And this is a very high quality attacking game against a very strong opponent. His zone attacks, especially in structures like the close Sicilian, which we'll look at. Spassky was great with pawn storms and maneuvering his pieces. But Tal just, had this feeling of where the pieces need to go and how an attack should be executed, no matter what resistance the opponent puts up or what structure the king tries to hide behind. He always found ways to break through, and that's the mark of an attacking player. And so you're always looking for resources, ways to position your pieces so that they're optimally placed against the king, so that at exactly the right moment, such as here when you're ready to go for bishop takes f2, you do go there. And this does require a lot of patience. As we saw, it took black a while to position his bishop to b7, to move his queen up from a4 to f4, find these right squares. So an attacking player is not just all tactics, it's also about being resourceful and positioning pieces optimally. So there's definitely a lot to learn from Tal here, and his sacrifices are always great to look at. Next, we'll look at an even more traditional attacking game, not as flashy with so many sacrifices, but still shows the essence of an attacking player. We're moving on to another game, also very nicely covered by Larry Christensen in his great book on attacking chess called Storming the Barricade. And this shows Tal's more sedate side, but again, he's at the core an attacking player, so he'll find a way to break through even in these seemingly quiet positions. Here he's white against Rudolf Teschner, played in Hamburg in 1960. So with f4, we have this f4, f5 break that I'm sure a lot of you players use in your own games that you're excited about, because this is the way that a lot of us like to execute attacks. And if you do like these types of structures where you do have the chance to break through with f4, f5 in the next part of the series, we are going to take an entire chapter just to look at these types of structures as they come up in various settings, including a lock structure in the King's Indian. You see f4, f5 breaks. Even in the advanced French, in the close Sicilian, this is more similar to, this is a bit of a different structure because the pawns are on e4 and c4 here, and black's pawn is on e5 instead of c5, but it's a very similar idea because the pawns here are not locked together, but they are more fluid. So this changes the dynamic of the breakthrough, but in essence, it works the same way. I mean, it's just a different way of playing with it. And the reason that we're looking at the attacking styles first is so that once you decide which style you think suits you best, you can go and find openings that suit that style. So if you like this game, maybe you'd want to start playing the Grand Prix attack or the close Sicilian. Or some of the other games that we looked at, maybe you'd want to start looking into gambits. Now, I should mention that some of the queen sacrifices that we looked at are a bit extreme. You're not going to be able to force that from playing normal openings, but if you're interested in attacking, there are definitely openings that you can look at in order to cater your repertoire to get these types of positions. So let's see how Tal handled this. So we get the f4 break-in. One of the purposes here is it immediately develops the bishop on f4. And here Tal is placing the pieces on their optimal squares like he always does. The queen and the bishop are a very powerful combination, as we saw in the other game. Here the bishop could go to h6, exchange the dark squared bishop, exploit the weaknesses around the king. It's a very good idea. What white did first here was go bishop g5 just to displace the queen. Again, the action, the reaction concept. So black is going to have to move the queen. Black can't go f6 because it would lock in the bishop on g7. That would be a major positional concession here, and Black just moved the knight from f6 in order to avoid this pin, but now the queen has to go to an awkward square like e8, which locks in the rook. And of course, in typical Tal fashion, white immediately takes control of the e and the f files. And you can see there's going to be something brewing here. In the first few games that we looked at, the rook on e1 was aimed against the opposing king. Here it's aimed against the queen, but the threats are just as strong. So bishop h6, aiming to exchange the bishop on g7. And like we're going to look at in these f4, f5 breaks, that's a very common way of exploiting the weaknesses in your opponent's camp. And a lot of times the break is used to create space for your bishop in order to achieve this type of position, especially where you have control of the f-file, but your opponent has a piece on the f-file like the knight on f6. And here that requires time for Black to remaneuver his knight and get it out of harm's way. So here white could take on g7 immediately and then try to fight for control of the dark squares. That would be perfectly acceptable, perhaps follow up with d4. But Tal had a bit of a better idea, and this is one of the ideas behind going knight h4, is this maneuver with knight f5. Very nice textbook sacrifice here, and it works so well when the rook on f1 is controlling the f-file and you already got the f4, f5 break in. Now, a lot of times the knight on f5 would exert pressure on a pawn chain if Black had pawns on g7 and h6, for example. Here, it's even more powerful because it's attacking the g7 bishop before white decides to exchange it. So white could exchange it, but instead Tal chooses to use it as a further point of weakness in Black's position. And Black really has no choice but to take the knight on f5, because he's either going to have to give up his bishop and face the attack against his own king, because if he takes on h6 here, for example, and white wants to exchange the bishops anyway, so he would take back with the knight. Now f7 is weak. To go king g7, then you would just simply go back to f5 if you want. And if you take, this would just be a better version of what happened in the game because Black's king is already exposed. So Black took immediately. Take back. Piece sacrifice. And white is okay with giving up his other bishop in the process on g2. Now Black had an option here if he was really greedy and wanted to preserve the piece. He could check first, take on g2 with the check, and then go knight g7 to remove the knight from e6 and also protect the rook from f8. So how would you continue here for white? Well, you may have been looking at a way to force queen g5 here, which is definitely the right intuition, and whenever you get this set up with knight f5, which removes the g-pawn protection against the opponent's king, that is something that you should watch out for. The queen on d8 hampers this plan. And it's not possible to remove the queen, so what you can do in the meantime is go f6 first. And this yields a great positional advantage, at least, for white. Black has two options to recapture here if he takes with the knight. Then we're playing against the bishop, which is a bit awkward on d4. It doesn't really do much on its own and is discoordinated from the rest of the pieces. So you can win back the piece here if you want and still preserve the attack. So we're evening out the material but without giving up the initiative, which is an important lesson to learn here. And after f6, if you take back with the bishop, slightly better option. Then you can put the knight on that d5 square, which is very important in attacks, as we've seen, and still find a way to chase the bishop and break through this way. And here Black had to play c6 because there was no other retreating square for the bishop if the bishop went to f6. Now we could do our plan. The queen would come to g5, no problems. to go c6, but this creates a further weakness. And yes, this rook sacrifice always comes up in order for white to have control of the g5 square, which is absolutely devastating, and you definitely want to give up the knight on h4 or f5 for attacking opportunities like this. Black sensed the danger, took on g2 first. White recaptured on e6. And black doesn't want to get too greedy by taking on f1 because this runs into e7, and again queen g5, always in the air. So black has to stay cool. He took back on e6. And now we ended up with a position where the material count is even, but the attack is not over yet, and just because there has been a mass exchange of pieces doesn't mean that the king is out of danger. We've seen plenty of examples where even in the endgame, one of the side's kings is in danger because all of white's pieces, here, white in this case, Talon, some of the other previous examples, the pieces are always placed optimally, and so by the time the endgame comes along, they are just poised and ready to continue attacking. Here, all black needs to do is play rook f8 to consolidate his pieces, so white has to act quickly and try to prevent that from happening. And we've seen so many examples already where Tal has this amazing sense of timing, which I think was so crucial for him and such a mark of his play, that he knew when he could take his time and reposition his pieces, and he knew when he had enough time on his side to even sacrifice a queen, like we looked at in the first few examples. But he also knew when time was of the essence, and that if he didn't act quickly, then his advantage would fizzle out. So immediately, queen e3, and black can't play rook f8 now. It's going to run into knight d5, which is going to create a lot of problems. So black has to spend some time going e5, but this gives white an opportunity to strike back, strike in the center with d4, chase the knight back. Black wants to be careful not to take on c4 here because white is going to end up playing knight d5 anyway, and you'll see that when the knight gets to f6, it's going to be too much for black to handle. So here's this other target in black's position, this h7 pawn, because the king is so exposed. There's no good place for the king to run. So instead, knight g6 is the right move. It's retreating, but it does shield the king temporarily. But now what happens is black's position becomes very fragile. He has this weakness on e6, and more importantly is that after h4 he has absolutely no counterplay. So this g6 knight is a good defensive piece, but it may as well be a pawn here because it's not going anywhere. And then h5 is going to make life very difficult for black here. So black is going to try to create some counterplay. He played c5 in the game here, but white has complete free reign. I mean, even though the material count is even, you definitely prefer white's position here. You get h5 in. All of black's pieces are cramped in backwards, and it's not a good idea to do that, especially when the king is still exposed and there still is some juice left in this attack. So white continues to reposition the pieces, induces e5, which creates weaknesses on these light squares here, and also creates this weakness on d6, which white can now capitalize, and any endgame here would end up favoring white. And this shows the trajectory of a very successful attack, is that good play in the opening, make the right breakthroughs at the right time, sacrifice at the right time, and get an advantage here, which is a tangible advantage in terms of time, and a structural advantage in terms of black's pawn on e6 being weak, and also his pieces being cramped, not being able to maneuver anywhere, and converting that easily. And black never had a chance to put up resistance or counterplay. This was a very one-sided game. I mean, from start to finish, white was always in control, was always making the action moves. The other side was reacting, and eventually that piles up psychologically, positionally. Practically speaking, that's one of the best ways to get an advantage, keep it, and convert it. And I hope that that is a lesson that you will take away from this series, is to keep piling the pressure on and keep making moves that force your opponent to react. So just look at this great sense of where all of the pieces belong, moving the queen to the g file, rook to the f file, bringing the queen in. And now, and only now, we're forcing an ending where white is clearly superior because the rook is already on the 7th rank. We've seen this happen several times before. There's an ending, it looks like, oh, the danger is over because there's no attack, but this is just as bad, if not worse, because this position is hopeless for black and minimal risk for white. I mean, the rook is already on the 7th rank, past g-pawn, pawn on d6 is atrocious, knight on e4 is so well placed, and this is where this fine positional and endgame technique by Tal shows itself, and again, why he was a world champion, because he could do it all. He's bringing the king in. It's funny to see that Tal likes to attack with all his pieces, including the king, so in the endgame, when the king is the most safe and can come forward, we know that we need to activate our king in the endgame. But here Tal takes it to a different level where, you know, he's basically mating with this king and the rook, and it's because black's rook is completely out of scope here. He can't break through or create counterplay. We'll look at examples later when we talk about fighting in the endgame, where a lot of times it's worth giving up one of your pawns so that you can activate your rook. Here, it would be better if black almost didn't even have this pawn on e3, so maybe he could go to e2, start checking from behind. Just do something to make it difficult for white, whereas here, sure, white has to watch out, make sure that this e-pawn is not promoting, but this king is just too far advanced. It's going to end up eating all the pawns and promoting either the g or the d pawn here. So it was a very nice game, not as flashy as some of the queen sacrifices that we saw early on, but just as strong, one-sided game from start to finish, great attacking game, and great example of what a modern attacking game would look like, but it still has all of the elements that we saw in the sacrifice in terms of the precise calculation, the attitude, forcing the reaction to every move, converting the advantage at the right time, and maximizing piece placement, especially for endgame, reacting to the timing, the necessities of the position, when to strike, when to be patient. All the marks of a good attacking player. If you feel like you have these elements, then try playing openings like the Grand Prix attack or the close Sicilian ones where you could get F4 or 5 breaks in. On the black side, try the King's Indian. If you want to learn more about those structures, not specific opening theory, but structures, very important, skeleton of chess, because once you learn those structures, you can apply that to different positions. So even though we didn't learn the exact theory of this Botvinnik system with the e4 and the c4 pawns, by learning the structures of these f4 or 5 breaks, we can use that knowledge, apply it here, and use those same elements, like this knight h4 to f5 maneuver, exchanging the bishop, the pinch-headed bishop on g7, exploiting those weaknesses, are all transferable skills just by learning the structure. But before you pick the structure that you want to learn, you have to decide which style of chess suits you better, not one which you would enjoy more or like to see more, but which one you think would be better suited to your style based on the skills that you have. And there are a lot of skills that underlie attacking players. It's not just tactics. And reinforcing the point that it's not just tactics, next we'll look at some more positional games by Tal, just to show how an attacking player approaches a target that is not necessarily the king. Here we're going to look at sacrifices where mate just happens to be a byproduct, but these sacrifices are designed to exploit the positional weaknesses in the opponent's position. So here we have Mikahil Tal against chess legend Bent Larsen. Tal is white. We have open Sicilian here, looks primed for an attack. So here already, Tal is positioning his pieces optimally, displacing his opponent's pieces, making sure that his coordination is superior to his opponent's coordination, which often proves decisive, especially if the game ends up going into an endgame. Okay, so it looks like we have the beginning of an attack in the works here. Black is striking back in the correct way, so in these types of structures, white usually tries to go for the throw, go for an attack with g4, g5, sometimes brings the h-pawn in. The f5 break could work sometimes, but you have to watch out because you could end up giving black the e5 square, and in the meantime, black begins to expand on the queen side and aims for the opposite castled king there. So how would you continue here for white? So after looking at Tal's games, you're probably thinking that you don't even have to move the knight on c3. Maybe there's a more immediate way to attack, get things going here. Maybe you looked at bishop takes g7. So if you're looking at moves like that, you have the right intuition and go with it, but a very common sacrifice, especially in these types of Sicilian structures here, that you absolutely must be aware of and you must look for every single move, is knight d5. No question. No, this attacks the bishop on e7. Retreating to d8 would be very sad and would just make things easier for white. Go queen h5. So in this situation, you would almost have to just accept this sacrifice. And white recaptures, so you might be thinking, well, where's the attack here after this? So a lot of times where white plays knight d5 in these types of structures, the opponent's king is still in the center, especially on the e-file, and white uses this as a way to pry open the e-file, and Tal did this a lot in some of the other games we've seen, but here the king is already castled. So this sacrifice is a positional one. The goal is to dominate the e-file, and the e5 and e6 squares are both already controlled by two of white's pawns, so black can't put a piece on the e-file in order to stop white from controlling it. And you'll see that when white gets control of the e-file, he'll basically get control of the game, and it's from a positional viewpoint, so this is very interesting to see. So knight d5 looked like it created a lot of threats, especially mating threats, and that forced black into making this positional concession. So I would say that Tal would be characterized more as a player who was a super grandmaster of playing imbalanced positions. Now, a lot of times, imbalanced positions tend to lead to attacks or arise from attacks, but they could also transform into positional types of games. And just because the target isn't the king here, but it's the e-file in this case, and clamping down on black's position, Tal would be just as good, because there are definitely still tactics available in a position like this, and it's just a bit of a different target in mind. So it's more about the essence of the play, the process, than even the actual goal, which is what would define an attacking player. And certainly a positional player could make a sacrifice like this too, but I would characterize positional players as maneuvering more to optimize the internal value of their own pieces versus going for more of a target, such as the king in most cases, or here we see a bit of a different target in the works. Again, if black retreats on d8, then almost all of the pieces are on the back rank, and all white needs to do is just to continue his plan with h4. And it doesn't even feel like white is down a piece because his pieces are so active. But rook f7 is an even worse move, even though it looks like it solidifies the control of e7 to stop white from breaking through on the e-file. It just paves the way for white to go h4, continue with his plan. And that was the purpose of locking down the structure, and it's amazing how Tal appreciated all of the elements of this position, that he would have such vast control of the e-file that he would have this unimpeded plan of storming down with h4, h5, and exploiting the weaknesses there. This just allowed him to take on f5 in the meantime. And again, he gets his rook to the 7th rank. He always seemed to find a way to break through on the 7th rank, which is amazing because every time I try to break through on the 7th rank, for some reason, it doesn't work out for me. But Tal just has that amazing sense of timing. So what happens if black tries to fight back and goes rook f7? Well, not the best idea because runs into g6. I hope you saw this. h5. And just look at how clustered the pieces are over here. It's terrible. They're not doing anything. And this is would be a checkmate in 5 moves if you could calculate this to the end. Very nice checkmate there. So rook f7, not a good idea. Black goes knight e5. Black is fighting back. That's the right way to do it. Can't take back on e5. The queen on f3 is hanging. But white was trying to activate his queen anyway. e4 is a good square. So yes, now, since there is no longer any semblance of an attack on the queen side, black tries to regroup his pieces to the king side and to the f-file, but it's just too late. So here, almost after exerting very little energy, white wins back the piece easily and ends up being ahead in material anyway, and also has an amazing attack and a very well placed rook. So queen can't move too far away from the rook because the rook on e7 is hanging. You have to be able to take back on f4 in that case. So chase the queen back a little bit, exchange. And another endgame where white comes out ahead because of optimal placement. It seems like every time the game converts into an endgame, white has extra tempos, or white is always the one breaking through to the 7th rank first. And that's not an accident. That's just because Tal had this amazing feel for the optimal placement of the pieces, so they're always poised to be ready, whether it's for an attack, whether it's for an endgame conversion. And from here on out, this is a straightforward game, but just backtracking a little bit so we can go over the highlights here of knight d5, which looked like it was a sacrifice for the purpose of an attack, but I mean, amazing, just positional lockdown here, playing for the e-file now. I don't think that f5 was the best move here for black, but what else can you do when white is going to come in with f5, f6, and then break open on the king side? So this, probably from black's perspective, was almost forced, but then white had no problem breaking down on the e-file. Won back the piece, and like I said, it's always a good sign when after you sacrifice, your opponent is almost begging to give back material just to even things out. Now what the other side should be doing is trying to keep the position as complicated as possible, put you on your toes to find the most accurate moves to finish things off, and that's something that we will cover in the section on resourcefulness, and in particular the section on fighting back from worse middle games. So white won back. The e-pawn is now up 2 pawns, and there's still more tactics in there. There seems to always be more tactics. After queen f4, this stops bishop takes d5 because of rook e8 check. So a good way to defend the pawn, really not giving black any chances here. And bishop c5, nice way to finish things off. And after king h8, among the various ways to win here, the most direct would be queen f7, even though the game was over before that. So another side of Tal, so to speak, but you can definitely see the same elements there of an attacking player. And I mean, that just goes to show that just if you classify yourself as an attacking player, there's definitely room in your games to make them more positional, to get them into favorable endgames. And you can't just study tactics and think that you're going to win based off of a quick trick or some sacrifice. There's a lot of substance that goes into it, and it's just another approach to the style of chess and another way of tapping into all of the elements on the board, not just the material value of the pieces, but the intangibles such as time, space, initiative, are all part of an attacking player, whether directed towards the king or towards some other nature of the position. We're at the end of the section of attacking in looking at different styles of chess, and we're at the end of Tal's game, so we're going to look at one last game by Tal. It's definitely going to involve another sacrifice, but this is a positional exchange sacrifice, and I thought this would be a good transition into our next section on positional styles of play. And here we really see Tal at his positional finest against none other than Anatoly Karpov, who we're going to look at for his own contributions to chess positional play. And this was played very much later in Tal's career in 1987. And so you see his style develop and mature and also keep up with the times. So by this time, players are not necessarily going into his attacks or playing things like the elephant gambit against Tal. They're playing more principled. And especially Karpov, who just had a great feel for where his pieces should be. But Tal was the master of optimizing his piece placement. So you can already see the bishop on d3, potentially aiming against that diagonal, having strong control over the e5 square, placing the rook on the e file as soon as he can. Bishop on g5, putting pressure on the e7 pawn. Just move by move, forcing his opponent to react to certain actions. Can definitely see these elements that make Tal and make attacking players great present in this game. So now Karpov goes bishop e6. Possibly he wants to place the bishop on d5, but now the pieces are a bit awkwardly placed, and Tal was always great at taking advantage of the discoordination of his opponent's pieces while optimizing the coordination of his pieces. And remember how the coordination of his pieces would outweigh material imbalances. So with this in mind, what did White play here? Yes, I told you it would be a positional exchange sacrifice, so he took the opportunity to take on e6, doubled up the pawns, and this sacrifice was almost a no-brainer, especially if you studied positional exchange sacrifices like this. You see now the rook on e8 is completely displaced. It's even more awkward than before. These doubled pawns have no scope. And even though White didn't end up being a pawn up, like you would usually want in an exchange sacrifice, because of the nature of the doubled pawns, White is effectively up a pawn, so he has a bishop and a pawn against a horribly misplaced rook on e8. And let's see how he takes advantage of this. Aiming immediately for the weakness, losing no time, because after a sacrifice, once you're low on material, whether you're going for an attack or for positional compensation, like in the example here, after the sacrifice has been made, you really can't afford to lose time unless you're sure your opponent can't do anything, like we've seen in some of the previous games. Here, Black can disentangle himself, so you have to act quickly. Bishop c4, queen e2, putting pressure on the e6 pawn. Now the knight retreats to d8, cutting off the coordination between the two rooks, and again, Black is reacting to what White is doing. So White initiated the action with bishop c4, queen e2. Black is just passive participant in this game. Rook e1, let's just look every move is some kind of active move and an optimization move at that. So black can no longer play e5 because there's too much on the e file, so now is a good opportunity to remaneuver the knight, since it's no longer necessary to hold e5. Place it on a better square, such as e4. It took black several moves to extricate his king from that diagonal, the a2 g8 diagonal with the bishop on b3, so that he could play e5, because black knows if he has any chance of surviving here, he needs to undouble the pawns, activate his pieces, and get them out of their passive squares. You need to do something about that knight on d8, but as long as you're protecting e6, the scope is very limited. So he finally gets e5 in, but it's a bit too late, doesn't accomplish much, because now white is going to simply dominate the light squares. And yes, black got e5 in, but this also opened up this bishop, and this is probably where Tal's attacking instincts come in, because once the king is cut off there, what if you bring in another piece and try to attack the king somehow? Well, king looks pretty well sheltered with the bishop on g7, pawns on h7 and g6, so why not go h4 and try to break through on the h file if you can. And in typical Tal fashion, we're not worried about regaining material. h5 immediately. Time is of the essence. We take back, and I mean, black was forced to take on h5, because otherwise if black takes on g6 and goes queen h5, that would be a very strong mating net. Black goes rook f8, tries to activate the pieces, but white remaneuvers the pieces to the correct squares. So it looks like the bishop was very well placed on b3, and indeed it was, but Tal senses when the pieces should be maneuvered to more optimal squares. And looks like he's hanging the rook, but wait a second. No, yeah, Tal just sacrificed a complete rook in order to displace the queen, because there's no defense here. Mate is threatened. Black has to go h6, and this is that precise calculation that was Tal's signature, especially in attacking games like this. Can't take on h6 because queen takes h6, queen h7, checkmate next move. But this is not even going to be a king hunt, because black's king is just out of squares. Again, the two bishops very strong together, definitely worth any material imbalance. There's dominating the board, especially with the queen. And white's king is totally safe. So bishop h6, and what a way to finish Karpov off. And this game was great for showcasing Tal's ability to sacrifice for a positional advantage, not just for an attacking edge like he was well known for. And this just goes to show that attacking players are composed of a lot more than just tactics and sacrifices. It's about feeling the nature of the position, taking into account the intangibles such as space, time, structure, coordination of pieces, very important, and that's applicable to not just attacking, but to also positional styles of play. And then we're going to move on now to the positional greats of chess history, where we're going to see their contributions to chess, and as opposed to here where the one side had a target in terms of the king or in terms of breaking through using a positional edge, we'll see that the positional players focused more on optimizing each piece internally and playing with the structural elements of the position, and both are definitely valid ways of playing. And nowadays you need to be a jack of all trades, but if you think that a style suits you more, that should guide which openings you study, which players' games you study, because those are the elements of your game that you will want to refine. So we have a lot more to cover. Let's keep moving on.